Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fenders. Thanks so much for coming. Today, I'm going to talk about variable fonts. What I'm going to do is give you a really quick explanation of what they are. We'll look at some code, so how you can use them, some fun things you can do, some practical things you can do, and we'll briefly talk about some of the performance benefits. So hopefully, we're going to touch on something for everyone with variable fonts. But before I do that, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on why I'm talking about variable fonts. So I'm a developer. I don't really consider myself a designer, but I do love to design. And I really enjoy experimenting with CSS and JavaScript to kind of push the boundaries of what we think is possible with designs on the web. Because of this, I started making a bunch of text effects a couple of years ago now, and I've presented these at Fenders before. If you've come along, you might have seen them. But during this process, it became really clear to me that variable fonts offer us with some really unique opportunities that standard fonts just couldn't provide us. And the reason for that is that variable fonts are one font file but act like multiple fonts. So where you might have previously had maybe 6 different font styles, like a lightweight, a regular weight, a bold weight, maybe a condensed and a kind of expanded version, as individual separate files, you can now have all of this information in the one single file. So the way that this is achieved, this is a really good projector, by the way. This is like the best it's ever looked. Sorry, normally this comes up a bit like low and I keep meaning to update it, but that looks great. Yeah, so it comes down to how the fonts are created. So a variable font contains one or more axes, and what they do is provide different variations between different extremes. So in this example, we start with a lightweight on one end, and then we have a black weight on the other end. So that might be a 200 to a 900 weight. Along that axis, the font values can be interpolated. And what that means is it can allow for intermediate designs, which will give us finer control over the variations. And that's something that we've never had before. Previously, we would be stuck with these named instances like bold, regular, semi-bold, and that was all that you had. But now you can have everything in between those as well, and that includes decimal places as well. And because they're interpolated, it means that we can animate between the values, creating smooth transitions between the variations. And we're not just limited to a single axis. A variable font can contain thousands of axes. And as you can see in this image, the interpolation doesn't just apply to a single axis at a time. It applies to the combinations of these axes as well. So if you wanted to have a light, thin weight, or a really wide bold weight, or something somewhere in the middle, you can completely do that with a variable font. So basically, in essence, a variable font gives you a single file with a greater amount of variation and a significant increase in style choices. And they don't just have to be standard things like weight or slant or width. It could be something really different and a bit weird, like these ones. This is my favorite variable font. It's called Decovar. It's an experimental variable font that was made to demonstrate the variable font spec when it was created. It's made by a type designer called David Burlow, and this is just 4 of many different axes that you can use in Decovar. And we can use variable fonts right now, and the way that we do it is really, really similar to how we would normally use fonts on the web. There isn't much extra that you need to do. For the most part, we set up our fonts exactly the same way using font face. So this is like a standard font face. There's a couple of differences. The main one and the most important is how we define variations to descriptors like font weight, font stretch, and font style. So in this example, we might have previously had a font face block, and that would have defined a weight of 200, and that would be our light version. And then we'd create a new block, and that would be our bold version, and we'd do that until we'd mentioned and set up every single one of our font styles. But now with a variable font, you can just specify a range. So in this case, SourceSend's variable has a font weight range of 200 to 900, but I've just said I want 200 to 700. And from here, the way we reference it everywhere else is exactly the same as we normally would, but instead of having to define one of the named instances like bold or 700, we can pick any value. It can be 658, 237. You can put decimal places in if you want. I think it defaults to like 4 decimal places. Any number between 200 and 700 can be used. So right here, we've already reduced the amount of CSS we need to define the fonts, and we've opened up a lot more opportunity in the design space. Now this is really great for font weight because we already have a CSS property that we can use. In the spec for variable fonts, this is defined as a registered axis, and that just means that it's common enough that they standardized it in the spec. There are 5 registered axes at the moment: width, weight, slant, italic. They are different things. They do different things. And optical size. And they're all mapped to pre-existing CSS properties. So if we want to do something custom, like the decovar example, we need a new CSS property. And that one is called font variation settings. What font variation settings does, it allows us to define as many registered and custom axes as we need. So in this example, I've created a variable font. It's called my variable font. And in the font variation settings property, I've defined 2 custom axes. They're both referenced by a 4-character code. One is called Gela. My dog's name is Gela, which is why Padma is laughing. It has an associated number value of 88, which represents the value of my axis. And then the second one is fellow, which has a 203 value assigned to it. So while registered axes codes are defined in the spec, so weight, for example, is WGHT, custom axis codes are defined by the font creator when they make the font. So that will be whatever they want it to be. You can use a registered axis in font variation settings. However, it is strongly recommended that you use their mapped CSS properties instead, so font weight or font stretch. The reason for this is you're not really meant to use font variation settings for it, but more practically, it's way easier for you to manage your web typography if you use font weight and font stretch and those properties instead. It gets super messy if you try and do it in font variation settings. So if you're worried about unsupported browsers, and there are one, which I'll talk about in a sec, you can use the CSS support syntax to check for support. So you define your fallback font, which in this case I'm using Sans Sans with a font weight of 700. And then inside the CSS feature detection, we just check for font variation setting support, and then we can load in our custom variable font with our custom font weight. Speaking of browser support, it's actually really, really good. All the major browsers support it now except for Internet Explorer 11. That's never going to get support because they don't develop it anymore. The only caveat I'll add is that aside from Chrome, which has its own renderer, the other browsers do require that you have the latest operating systems. So for Mac, you need to have High Sierra and above. Otherwise, they won't work because they rely on the operating system to do so, but it will always work in Chrome because for some reason they decided they'd render it in the browser instead. So we know what variable fonts are, hopefully, and we know how we can use them in CSS. So what I want to do is briefly touch on the performance benefits. I did a whole 30-minute talk on the performance benefits of variable fonts. I'm not going to go into that much detail. If you do want to talk about that, come see me afterwards. What we're going to do is talk about 2 things in particular. Normally, when we think about web fonts and their impact on performance, there's a few things that we focus on. 2 of those are the number of font requests and the font file size. So we can reduce the number of font requests with things like CDNs and caching, but often it means that we need to plan our typography And we'd weigh up the cost of design over the cost of performance. And then we'd have to justify that cost before adding any new styles in. And this is why we typically have a bold font, a regular font, and maybe like an additional font. And that's why developers often like put that constraint on the design. But because variable fonts can contain multiple variations in one file, we've immediately reduced the number of requests by simply using a variable font. So that kind of solves that problem. Of course, if the font has all of the information in it, I'm sure you're wondering what that does to the file size. So now we're going to talk about that. When we think about font file sizes, there are a couple of ways that you can optimize. These techniques still apply to variable fonts. They all work exactly the same way. And the first one is using efficient web font formats. So what I'm going to do is compare the standard version of Source Sans, which is on GitHub, it's open source, with the variable version of Source Sans. This is a single weight, so it's the bold weight, I think. Every version of the weight is about 234 kilobytes as an OTF file, and the WOF2 version compresses down to 111. Really important to note, Source Sans is a massive font because it's got a lot of different language support in it, but we'll talk about that in a sec. So the variable font is 405 kilobytes as an OTF file, but it's only 112 as a WOF2 file, which is 1 kilobyte more with significant improvement on the options that you have. To me, that's a pretty good trade-off, and I'd be happy with that. I should mention it is going to vary between fonts. Like, they're not all going to be this great. Some of them will be better. Some of them might be worse. So before you like dive on in and want to change to everything, definitely check before you do that. The other thing that you can do with optimizing web fonts is subsetting. So has anyone subset a font before? No, okay, this is great. So font subsetting is when you reduce the amount of characters in the font to just the ones that you need. So often something like Source Sans has a lot of language support, but you might not need all of those different language support, so you can strip those characters out, and that can significantly reduce the file size. So I subset Source Sans to the Latin characters and numbers, and that includes the exclamation marks and stuff like that. The single weight drops to 16 kilobytes, and the variable font drops to 27. This is super simple to do. I used a tool called Glyphhanger by Filament Group. And you can see here the variable font is quite a bit larger percentage-wise, but it's still smaller than 2 of the single weight combined. And normally, if you're going to have a font in your site, you'll at least have regular and bold, typically. So I still think it's a good trade-off because you get a lot more options with the variable font. Yeah, so if that's kind of performance, and if you want to talk more about some really deep, specific stuff, come see me afterwards because I can talk about that all day. 30 minutes. Because that's how long my other talk was. So if we're able to solve some of these technical problems, so we can use them in browsers, we don't have to do anything too complicated that varies too much from how we use them at the moment. And we've solved some of the concerns and some of the potential issues around performance and fallbacks. We can start to shift our focus. We don't need to trade off design for performance when it comes to fonts and typography. And then creativity can start to drive our choices instead of technical limitations. Because with variable fonts, we gain a lot more flexibility in our design opportunities. Designs which would have previously been a really heavy burden on performance or simply impossible because the font styles didn't exist are now completely possible. We can start to create all sorts of different variations and styles, and we can forget about those perceived limitations and figure out how we can use this technology to create better or more interesting experiences for our users. Jello is the name of my dog. I can't remember if I mentioned that. I did, because Padma laughed. Yeah. He does this is called Jello Epsom, and I use it for all of my demos now. So it does feature later as well. And with variable fonts, the tone and the intent of our words can be more effectively represented, and we can worry less about the impacts of loading in too many font weights. And we can embrace the learnings and the growth of print design, but benefit from the flexibility and the interactive nature of the web as well. I should mention, I hate how this looks, but I love that it's covered in pictures of Jell-O, so I leave it in anyway. Every time I've given a talk, I've taken this out and then I've put it back in at the last minute because I wanted to have pictures of Jell-O in my presentation. So there you go. So with the interactive and the animations and the flexibility side of things, and if we think about being creative with our text and our typography on the web, we can start to do some really interesting things. And because variable fonts can have this interpolated range of values, we can create those animations and those transitions, and we can do that with our text. We don't need things like SVG or Canvas or other JavaScript libraries. This one I made like a year ago. Some of you have probably seen it because I've demoed it here before. This uses Decovar. And with that in mind, we can start to achieve effects and techniques that we might already be familiar with. So we can use CSS animations, transitions, and we can even hook into various JavaScript events like viewport resize, scroll position, or sensor APIs. Importantly, before I get into some examples, it does matter if the font exists. Because this is tied to a font, you need the font in order to make these effects. So I see this as a really good opportunity to get to know type designers and to talk to them about things that you might like and to learn about their process, because making fonts is really hard. Everything I'm going to show you is going to look pretty straightforward from a code perspective, but that's only because somebody has spent probably months making a beautiful, amazing font. So keep that in mind as we're going through. Now what I'm going to do is we're going to look at some code, and I'm going to show you some ways that you can animate and interact with variable fonts. I'm going to start with CSS animations, and we're going to make that grass demo that I just brought up. So the grass grow demo uses Decovar by David Berlow. What I do first is set up my heading or whatever, reference my font family, which is Decovar, and then I'm going to use font variation settings because it's a custom axis. There are two axes that we need for this demo. We need one called inline and one called skeleton worm. This is what inline looks like. Cool. I think it looks like a hedge. So that's why I like it. And then skeleton worm looks like this. I noticed that when I was playing with Decovar in the beginning, there was a bit of an interpolation error. And when you combined these two axes, they created points. It wasn't intended, but David Berlow seems okay with my demo, so he seems fine with it. Happy accidents. In order to get it to animate, this is where we jump into the CSS again and we make our keyframe animation, and it looks like this. It's a few lines of CSS. I've called the animation grow. At 0%, which is our first keyframe, I am setting inline and skeleton worm to their maximum value of 1,000. And the reason for this is I want it to start expanded. Then at 50%, we're going to set skeleton worm back to 0, but we're going to leave inline as it is. What that's going to do is bring the little knobbly bits back in so they disappear. And then it's going to loop back round to 0% and go expanded again. Then we just add the animation to our H1. It's called grow. I made it go for 4 seconds. It's got linear easing and it runs infinitely. And that pretty much makes the effect. Now, I've added a little bit of extra CSS. It's got a background image and some text shadows, but most of the heavy lifting is done by the font and a little bit of CSS code for the animation. Most of the work is done for you in the font itself. And I think that's really, really amazing and really awesome because it doesn't require you to write lots of lines of complex code in order to create these effects. And you don't have to understand how like SVG paths and everything work to animate it using SVGs. And there's a lot of things that you can do with a few lines of CSS and a variable font. This font is by Underwear. It's like a writing font. Can make some weird thing. This is a Decovar. It's got lots of like blend modes and stuff on it. This is just a hover interaction, so it just changes the weight based on hover. It uses transitions. It's Gingham by Christopher Coberlin. I don't really know how to explain this, but it's really cool. I had a really great idea for this one today, so I might make a new demo of it, but I think it would be great if it tracked the day and then like depending on the time of day where the sun is, it's in a different position. I think that'd be super cool. This is probably my favorite demo, and the reason that I love it is because it's a really good example of why variable fonts are different to other fonts. Because you can see here, I have a text shadow on this, and as the bits in the font disappear, the text shadow disappears as well, because the text shadow is attached to the font, and instead of just applying an effect to the characters, we're actually taking part of the font away. And that is really, really amazing to me. And if you want to, you can do emojis with Zycon. This is the cat emoji, and it sits up and down. There's like a bicycle man and an owl, and there's a lizard. Interestingly, this font was made 10 years ago for an early version of the spec, and it's only just being able to be used on the web. So we've waited a long time for this standing up cat. Now, it's not just that these are beautiful or cool effects. They demonstrate that as developers and designers, we can control the font itself. It's kind of like having an API to the font that we can manipulate. And that means that variable fonts allow typography on the web to adapt to the flexible nature of our screens, environments, and devices. And there's currently a lot of work being done with CSS Media Queries. It's the level 5 spec, and that aims to give us more control over our designs based on environments like contrast and color schemes. Now, this is still in draft spec, but there is one that you can experiment with right now, and that is using the much hyped operating system feature of dark mode. And if you want to use dark mode, a couple of lines of CSS. What I've got here is I'm using a font called Chi by Ono Typeco. I'm using their temp axis. I've got a transition, so when I change it, it'll animate, so you can see. And then inside the media query, I check for prefers color scheme of dark, and then I'm just going to change the temperature axis to 1000. And that looks like this. So I'll just change it to dark, and it oozes because it's dark mode. So it's creepy. And then if you go to light, it'll transition back to the normal state. When I made this, the obvious choice would have been blood, right? But I thought that was too obvious, so I went with slime, and I'm really, really happy with it. It's one of my favorite examples. So this is fun, but more practically, we can modify the contrast and the styles to ensure better legibility. And as CSS develops, we can have more access to different environmental and system features that allow us to take advantage of the user's unique circumstances. And we can start to design our typography to adjust to things like screen widths. So that might allow us to change the font so that at smaller screens, it's heavier for better legibility, or at larger screens, it's thinner and has more detail for a nicer reading experience. And you can do the same thing with things like more condensed spaces. You can condense the width and have the font take up less space. And on a wider screen, you can have it a lot wider. And we can make use of a bunch of different JavaScript events like resize, scroll, mouse move, and other APIs. So this uses Chi by Ono Typeco again, and it's a scroll example. And as you scroll, the font will change. And this kind of thing can be really, really exciting and really great for storytelling on the web and how we want to bring our content in and the meaning and the intent of our words. Interestingly, it took me longer to figure out what word to put in this than it did for me to write the code that made it. So if that says something about storytelling on the web, I don't know what does. Now, the great thing about this example and the great thing about the JavaScript events is that once you have the formula for manipulating the fonts, you can apply it to all kinds of things. And I've already written that formula, so now you will all have it as well. So you can just take it, it's on GitHub or CodePen, and you can just have fun. So I'm going to show you how to do it because it's only a few lines of JavaScript. What we're going to do is use the example of changing the font weight to the viewport size. There is a way to do this with just CSS, but I want to show you the JavaScript way so you can use it for a bunch of other things because I'm going to show you some cool use cases afterwards. Now, the problem with this scenario is that we might have a font weight of 200 to 900 and a viewport size of, say, 320 to 1440. So this is not only different ranges, but they're different units of measurement. So we need to align these two sets of values so we can manipulate the font based on one or the other. So first, what we're going to do in this case is get the event that we want. So that will be viewport width, and you can do that with something like window.innerWidth. Then we're going to create a new scale. So rather than the pixel values, we're going to convert it to a range of 0 to 0.99. And we do this by taking the current window size and minusing our minimum value. So I'm going to make that 320. And then we divide that by the maximum viewport size, so like 1440, and we'll minus 320 of that as well. And what that'll do is give us a value from 0 to 0.99. Then we take that new window size and we multiply that by the minimum weight minus the maximum weight, and then we add the maximum weight on. So that'll be 200 minus 900 plus 900. Once we have that, that will give us a value from 200 to 900 matched to the viewport size. And then the last step is you update your CSS in some way. I'm going to use CSS Custom Properties because it's a really neat way to do it. So in my CSS, I have a custom property called --weight. And then with a little bit of JavaScript, you can find the element that you want. You set a style property of your weight custom property, and then you pass in your new font weight that we just made. When we put that all together, you can chuck that in a function, and then you can attach it to an event listener like resize, and then whenever the browser resizes, it's going to update the font weight using the custom property. Obviously, there are ways to optimize this and stuff, but in its simplest form, this will give you a fluid variation attached to the viewport width. And that might look something like this. So as it gets smaller, the font weight gets heavier. And I'm changing this at different variations as well. So the top paragraph is always a little bit bolder. And the headline also shrinks in width so that it doesn't wrap onto a new line because I don't want it to do that. I want it to stay on that single line. So that actually condenses as well based on the size of the viewport. And as I said, we can apply this to all sorts of effects, like this one. This uses the sensor API in your phone, and it detects the device position. What it does is it changes the slant of the text, and then once it hits a certain threshold, it'll all fall over to the side. Now this demo is brand spanking new. I made this on the weekend, and only a few people have seen it. This uses a sick font. Oh, I've got a typo. It's called Wool by Scribbletone. They called it that because that's what people say when they see it. Now I'm going to move to a live demo for this because I feel like you need to see it in order to fully appreciate it. So let's just get rid of this and bring it up. So this is connected to the mouse movement. So as you move horizontally, it changes the stretch of the slinky based on the mouse, but it also rotates the font as well. And then there's also a vertical axis to change how far the font stretches vertically. I freaking love this. I emailed them on the weekend and said, hey, you don't have a web license for your font. Can I have a web license? And they went, it's a bit glitchy, but here, you can just make some experiments with it. And I was like, yes, this is awesome. So cool. Look at that. I have another idea for a great demo for this. I just haven't had time to make it yet. So I have another brand new demo, which I made recently, because you can also have the font respond to audio input or the sound of your voice. With the growing use of devices like Alexa, Google Home, voice recognition is becoming much more prevalent. So something like this could be really useful in visually representing conversational UIs to show like the person's tone or the intent of their message. So let's go to example number 2, if I can find my mouse. Right, are you ready? Okay. So this detects the volume. I'm very loud. Once it hits the threshold that I set, it will give you confetti. And this is really great, right? So you could change this however you want. You can add color things into it. Everyone should woo at this point. Just go woo. Yeah, look at that. This is awesome. Yes, I love this demo. I tried to convince my boss that this is how we should launch our projects. Like everyone needs to woo into the computer and then it'll go like, yes, launch, and then we'll get confetti. She was on board, but then I'm kind of not sure if she was being sarcastic. So that is Chi by Ono Typeco. I use that one a bit. Now, we can also improve the legibility of our text with new features that allow us to query the characteristics of the user's display or light level. So this demo currently only works in Chrome because they deprecated the old, oh, hang on, wait. Where's my mouse gone? There it is. Let me just refresh that so it's not like going in the background. So what I'm going to do here is get my phone out and my torch. And I'm going to put my phone up to the sensor. And then what's happening is it's detecting the light that's around my laptop, and the font is changing based on the level of light input. So the brighter it is, the bigger the dots get, and the darker it is, the smaller they will get. What's really great about this demo is in different environments, you could make the font bolder or wider or whatever in order to make it more legible, because the environment that your user is in does matter when they're interacting with your site. And it's only because variable fonts give us control over these elements that we can fine-tune the font characteristics to maximize things like legibility, readability, and the overall accessibility of our website text. And whilst they might seem a bit silly, they're really good demonstrations of the possibilities, because this is a level of control over fonts that we've never had before. It's unprecedented. And we can do this, like I said, not just for usability and accessibility, but also for storytelling and to tell and present our content in more interesting and more creative ways. And because technology like CSS is always improving, we now have more opportunities than ever to combine, create, and present content on the web in more creative, more meaningful, and more purposeful ways. And we can do so in a way that's more performant and more accessible. We don't have to trade those things off. We can have great design and accessible and performant websites. Right now, in my opinion, there has never been a better time to be a developer or a designer for the web. And variable fonts open up doors that have never existed for us before, and they give us opportunity to think more creatively for our users. At the very least, with a variable font, we can improve the performance of our website. But at the best, we can make it more usable, we can make it more accessible, we can make our content more meaningful, and we can be more creative. We can have a bit of fun with it. And that, to me, is what is really, really exciting about variable fonts and the future of web typography. Thanks very much. here are some resources. I will share these out later, but there's some links and places you can find the variable fonts, and these are some people you should follow on Twitter who do awesome stuff with variable fonts. So thanks very much.